are quite yellow, and that is why we don't pot orchids in soil. That is why we use orchid bark. So every once in a while I get asked, how do you repot an orchid? So we're going to do another video. So here we go with this jumbo phalaenopsis, and it has needed a repot. As you can see, the roots have just pushed it out of this pot. This is decorative. We're actually potting 2 orchids in this video. We're doing this mini one as well that has been living in a peat moss plug, and we're potting it into this little ceramic clay thing. And so let's look at this. So we can actually start by looking at these flower spikes, and they are gone. So where are my scissors? We're gonna chop, and I'm gonna chop this one here because that's where that one has gone. And then we're just gonna pull the stakes out. So the first step is to just break apart that peat moss plug, and you guys know I do not like peat moss plugs, but they do obviously work well enough for me to use it for the almost year that I've had this orchid. I'm just going to gently massage this and start taking this moss off, trying to be pretty careful with the roots. This moss is very compacted in the middle of this, so I'm going to guess right now that the roots are going to be quite yellow, because that is what happens when orchids don't get good airflow. They live on the sides of trees in the wild, so naturally they get a lot of air around the roots. So when that doesn't happen, the roots get yellow. So that's why we don't pot them in soil like other houseplants. Alright, so I've got almost all the sphagnum moss out from all of the roots that I can get, and as you can see, these roots that were in the middle are quite yellow. This is why I don't like peat moss plugs, because you saw all the beautiful roots on the outside, but this is what we're left with when I look at all the healthy roots. And that is why we don't pot orchids in soil. That is why we use orchid bark and sphagnum moss. And I'm actually going to show you everything we're using in this video. These are the 2 things I use in almost every orchid I have, and you can find them at Lowe's, so they are super easy to get. And since this orchid has grown so much, I am upgrading the pot from this to this. As you can see, it's not too much bigger because orchids do still like to feel snug in their pots, but it does give a little bit more room for those roots to spread out and grow. But before we do that, a good thing to do is cut off any dead roots, and you can see some in here. This is a dead root. It is squishy, it is thin, it has started peeling off, and you just see the little string inside. And anything that is mushy, you will want to cut off. These yellow ones are not mushy, so I'm not going to cut them. These roots overall look pretty healthy, and that is because I keep my orchids on the dry side. That is why these middle ones that are yellow are not rotting. But I am going to cut off any of the dead ones that I do see, just because they will only rot in the pot and start breaking down the medium even faster. So this is not hard. You would rather cut too little roots than too many roots. Rotting old roots is a long-term problem, and most of the time it is not the biggest concern. So don't worry if you're not cutting any, that is just fine. You do not have to. The orchid's roots are nice and clean. We only have the healthy ones left. So now I'm just going to set it into the pot and start filling bark around it. Now I do highly recommend potting your orchid in a clear pot, because then you'll be able to easily see what is happening with those roots. Although if you do not have a clear pot, that is just fine. I do recommend, however, using only bark, because then it is going to be a lot harder to overwater. And we are still going to do the same thing. We're going to fill it up with bark. And as you're putting bark in, make sure you are shaking the pot, patting it, doing all of this kind of stuff, because that'll help it all settle down in and make the orchid feel secure, and make sure all those little air pockets are actually getting filled with bark. Alright, now that I have bark filled up mostly to the top, I am actually going to add a little bit of sphagnum moss just around the rim, about ½ an inch, not too much. And I'm just adding this so I don't have to water the bark as often. It keeps in that humidity a little bit more in the bark layer. But something to keep in mind is this sphagnum moss on top does dry out much faster, so it is not a reliable way to know when to water your orchid. So do not look to it in order to know when to water. Alright, so now the sphagnum moss is in, so all I have to do is water. Make sure you're only watering when the roots have turned completely sober. This is why clear pots help, because then you can tell when it has completely dried. Now you may see me use sphagnum moss at the top and or bottom of some of my pots, and I generally do that in clear pots because it'll hold on to water and humidity a lot longer, so I don't have to water as often. But when I don't use clear pots, only using bark is a great alternative, because it is quite hard to overwater this. All I have to do is put them in a sunny window where they won't get any harsh midday sunlight. They can get some morning or some evening sunlight. I'd recommend about 2 hours of direct sunlight a day, and they will be thriving. And you can wait for spring or fall when there is a 10-degree drop in temperature for about 20 nights, and then they will bloom again, and that is very exciting. So good luck, and I hope you thrive with your new little orchid.